The morning she saw his arm, Eleanor Marsh had been carrying linen for 7 years. She had learned the geometry of Thornvale Park the way one learns a language spoken only in whispers, by necessity, without ever intending to become fluent. She knew which corridor ran cold before dawn, which stair creaked on the third tread, which rooms the Viscount occupied in sequence through the morning hours, and how many minutes she had to work before he moved from his dressing chamber to his study. She knew the sound the west garden gate made in October wind, and the particular silence of the house on Sunday mornings before the household stirred, and the exact weight of the silver tray when it was laid for two. She was good at her work. She was invisible at her work. These two things had come, over time, to feel like the same thing. It was the first week of October, the light still amber at 7 in the morning. The kind of light that falls sideways and makes ordinary things look as though they are remembering something. She carried fresh linen to the Viscount's study, a task she had performed 300 times, perhaps more, and she expected to find the room empty, as it usually was at this hour. Lord Ashbourne was at his writing desk, bent over a letter, his coat hanging on the chair behind him, and his shirt sleeves turned back to the forearm for the work. She saw the left arm first. The scar ran from the base of his thumb to the crook of his elbow, pale and ridged, the skin smooth with old healing, in the unmistakable way of a burn that had gone deep. The shape of it was like a river in winter, branching, directional, pulled always toward the elbow, as though something had poured downward, and the skin had simply followed where it went. She knew that scar. She had not seen it in 7 years. She had not seen the face that went with it. She had been half-conscious, coughing smoke, understanding only that a hand had caught her arm and dragged her through the kitchen doorway and into the cold air of the lane, and then she had been on the ground with her cheek against the frost, and the hand had gone. She had been 17 years old, and she had not understood what had happened to her for a full minute. Lying on the cold ground with her lungs clearing, and by the time she sat up, there was no one on the lane. Only the sound of the fire behind her and the particular smell of a burning house, which is different from any other smell in the world. She had described the scar to the magistrate's clerk 3 weeks later, when she was staying at the inn at Henford, and trying to make sense of what remained of her life. The clerk had written it in his book, slowly, and nothing had ever come of it. The linen slipped in her grip. She caught it. She set it on the press beside the door, with the careful deliberateness of a woman who has been trained not to make noise, not to disturb, not to intrude on whatever a room was doing before she arrived. Lord Ashbourne looked up. He had eyes the color of a winter sky just before snow, pale gray, almost colorless, set under dark brows and a face that gave very little away. He was 34 years old, and he looked it, authority worn into the lines around his eyes, his jaw a still and measured thing. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, with a quality of attention she had never been able to name, and had therefore tried very hard not to think about. "The press is full," he said. "Leave the extra in the outer hall." "Yes, my lord," she said. She did not look at his arm again. She was already at the door. What she did not yet know, as she carried the remaining linen down the corridor and into the gray October morning of Thornvale's back passage, was that the Viscount had watched her go with his pen held motionless above the letter he was no longer writing. He had seen something cross her face at the moment. She looked at the desk. He had not been able to name it, either, and he was a man who made it his business to be able to name what he saw. If you have not yet settled in for Eleanor's story, do so now. She has been carrying something for 7 years, and she is about to discover she has not been carrying it alone. She had come to Thornvale at 21, recommended by a placement agency in the market town of Wexford, where she had spent the 3 years prior to her arrival doing whatever work presented itself to a young woman of no family and no prospects. She had kept accounts for a draper on the high street for 8 months. She had served as a companion to an elderly widow in a house that smelled of camphor and old paper. She had mended linen, carried coal, read aloud to a magistrate's wife who was too proud to admit her eyesight had failed. She had been, in those 3 years, a great number of things that no one had ever asked her to be. Before Wexford, there had been a brief, difficult year at her aunt's house in Lincolnshire. An aunt who had taken her in out of obligation and made the obligation felt in every room. Before Lincolnshire, there had been the fire. Her father, Dr. Edmund Marsh of Ashfield Cottage in the village of Henford, had been the kind of man who kept careful records. His patient accounts were meticulous. He remembered birthdays and the names of tenants' children and which families in the village had fallen on difficulty, and he kept those records not for the purpose of being repaid, but because he believed that attention was itself a form of care. He had a way of writing letters that made the recipient feel, for the length of reading, that they were the only person in the county worth writing to. Eleanor had been 17 when he died, in the blaze that took Ashfield Cottage to the ground in the space of an hour on a cold November evening, and the thing she had grabbed when she fled, instinctively, because it was beside the kitchen door and her father was not, was the letter he had left her that morning on the table. Folded small and sealed with a bit of wax. Her name, in his careful hand on the outside. She had carried it across 4 years and 3 counties and every position she had occupied since. She had never read it in front of anyone. She read it sometimes alone, in the particular small hours when the weight of invisible work grew heavy, and she needed to hear his voice without making a sound. She was, by any accounting that Thornvale Park's polished world would care to make, nobody. The county had decided this long before she arrived, and had been confirmed in small ways ever since. Lady Sefton had said it plainly enough at the autumn gathering. The second year Eleanor had served at Thornvale, turning to the Dowager Viscountess with her fan at a precise and dismissive angle. The new girl, the dark-haired one with the steady hands. One forgets, doesn't one, that they see everything and understand nothing. Just a chambermaid, of course. The Dowager, whose name was Agatha Cahill, and who had governed Thornvale's social geography for 40 years, with the serene confidence of a woman who had never been given reason to doubt her own judgments, had agreed with a single inclined nod that meant she had filed the observation away for potential later use. Eleanor had been carrying a tray at the edge of that room. She had heard every word. She had smoothed her expression and carried the tray out. 7 years of that. 7 years of smooth expression and steady hands, of knowing which stair creaked and when to vanish. And now this, a scar on a man's forearm in October light, and the knowledge, settling into her chest with the quiet certainty of a stone dropped in still water, that the man who had pulled her from the burning house was the Viscount of Ashbourne, in whose service she had spent 3 years of those 7, and who, she was nearly certain, did not know that she knew. She told no one. She told no one for 3 days, which was 3 days of carrying linen and pressing her thoughts into a small manageable space, and not once allowing her eyes to drift toward Lord Ashbourne's sleeves when she was in the same room with him. She was very good at not looking at things. Then Mrs. Scatcher. Dunmore found her standing at the linen cupboard with her hands pressed flat on a folded sheet, and nothing moving in her face that ought to have been still. And the housekeeper, who had been at Thornvale 30 years, and who knew the difference between a servant at rest and a servant holding something in with both hands, said quietly, "Eleanor, come and have tea." They sat in the still room, the October wind pressing at the window, and Eleanor said only that she had experienced a moment of recognition. She had once seen a scar like the Viscount's. A long time ago in circumstances she had not spoken of for some time. She did not say where. She did not say when. Dunmore was a woman who understood what she was not being told, and who had the wisdom to know that the understanding was enough. She poured the tea and said, after a long moment, "He is a private man. Whatever he has carried it without complaint and without asking others to share the weight of it." A pause. That is not nothing, for a man of his position. Eleanor said nothing. She drank her tea and looked at the window and thought that Mrs. Dunmore was right, and that the thought was no comfort at all, and that she was becoming very tired of thoughts that were true and useless. It was the following week that Grantham Cahill arrived, with his intentions arrayed about him like a coat that did not quite fit. Grantham was 38, the Viscount's first cousin, a man who had spent a significant portion of his adult life calculating what he was owed by birth and finding the calculation always slightly in his favor. He had grown up at the edge of the Cahill family's consequence, close enough to its warmth to feel it but not quite inside it, and he had organized his character around the conviction that this circumstance was a temporary error rather than a permanent condition. He arrived with a carriage, a manservant, and Miss Helena Brandt, 22 years old. The daughter of a well-positioned family from Derbyshire, possessed of excellent manners and a composed prettiness, and a way of entering a room that suggested she had been told all her life that every room she entered was improved by her arrival. He had brought her as a suggestion. He had presented her as a courtesy. The distinction mattered to him. He placed her at the Viscount's right at dinner on the third evening of his visit, and when the port was being poured and the ladies had withdrawn and Eleanor was clearing the side table, said to the two other gentlemen present, "My cousin would do well to settle the question before another season passes. There are perfectly suitable options, readily available to any man who is paying attention. The difficulty with a man who has not made his choice is that the household runs on the assumption that no one has been chosen, and certain members of the staff." Here his eyes had moved, briefly and deliberately, across Eleanor's plain dress and cap as she moved the candlestick from the side table to the hall tray. May develop incorrect ideas about their station. Just a chambermaid, after all. And one ought not to confuse attentiveness with anything it is not. The other gentlemen had laughed quietly, in the way of men who laugh to keep a room smooth when they are not entirely certain what they are being asked to smooth over. Eleanor had continued to clear the side table. Her hands were steady. They had been steady for 7 years. She did not look toward the head of the table where Lord Ashbourne had not laughed at all. The afternoon she understood that he had seen her, truly seen her. Past the smooth expression and the steady hands, came 3 days after Grantham's dinner. One of the kitchen girls, a 15-year-old named Polly with a broad open face and a habit of dropping things when she was frightened, had been accused by the visiting lady's maid of taking a pearl button from a sewing basket left in the morning room. The accusation was untrue. Eleanor knew it was untrue because she had been in the morning room when the button rolled from the basket and under the writing table, and she had seen it roll there, and she had meant to retrieve it before it was lost and had been called away to the upstairs corridor before she could. Polly had not been in the morning room at all. Polly had been in the scullery peeling carrots, as Eleanor could confirm because she had passed the scullery door and heard the girl singing. She found Polly in the back passage with her apron pressed against her face, weeping in the specific silent way of a girl who has learned that crying audibly leads to worse outcomes than crying quietly. The dismissal was 20 minutes away. Mrs. Dunmore was occupied with the dinner preparations. Eleanor took the girl into the still room and asked her 3 precise questions and listened to the answers, and then went to the visiting lady's maid and described what she had observed, the button, the angle of the table, the precise sequence of events in the morning room. The lady's maid was not convinced. She had made her report and intended to stand by it. Eleanor then went to the butler, Mr. Fitch, and asked him to look under the writing table before anything in the morning room was disturbed. He found the button. She told him the full sequence of events, calmly and without embellishment. She then went to Mrs. Dunmore, who had by this time returned, and presented the sequence a 3rd time and said, "Polly has no protection here except the truth, and the truth will go unspoken, unless someone says it clearly and does not stop saying it until it is heard. I am saying it." She did not know, in that moment, that Lord Ashbourne had been in the corridor beside the still-room door for the whole of her exchange with Mrs. Pastet. Dunmore, holding a letter he was carrying to the porter's office, not moving, not announcing himself, listening to her say, "The truth will go unspoken unless someone says it." She did not know it until 3 days later, when Polly was still in service and the subject was understood to be closed, and she was returning a stack of books to the library, that he had been there at all. She met him in the gallery, and he stopped, and he looked at her for a moment, not briefly, not in passing, and then he said only, "Miss Marsh," A pause, half a step, and then he walked on. He had never used her name before. In 3 years of service, not once. Her pulse did not return to its ordinary pace for the better part of an hour, and she was very annoyed about this. The call to the study came on a Tuesday evening, near the close of October. The fires lit in the main rooms and the grounds outside, already bare and gray beneath the early dark. Mrs. Dunmore brought Eleanor the message herself, which meant it was a singular enough event to warrant Mrs. Dunmore's personal attention, and which told Eleanor nothing except that she should straighten her cap and prepare herself for something she could not anticipate. He was at his writing desk again, this time in his coat, his sleeves down and buttoned. The lamp on the desk cast the room in a warmth that did not quite reach the corners. His face in the lamplight was careful and had not slept enough. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He looked at the lamp for a moment and then at her. "Your family name is Marsh," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, my lord." "Your father was a physician. His name was Edmund." The name in his voice, precise, careful, spoken with the deliberateness of a man who has said it alone in a room and is now saying it aloud for the first time in years, did something to the air between them that she could not have described precisely if she had been asked. She did not answer immediately. She said, "Yes." He nodded once. He said, "Edmund Marsh was a man of integrity. I want you to know that I believe it to be true, without qualification, whatever conclusions others may have drawn afterward about the circumstances of his household." She looked at him steadily. "What conclusions did the county draw, my lord?" He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him decide something. He said, "None that were warranted by the facts, and none that I permitted to stand unchallenged, though the machinery of standing a challenge sometimes moves with a slowness that is its own particular difficulty." She did not understand the whole of what he meant. She understood enough. Something that had been held for 7 years in a specific and particular posture inside her chest shifted, slightly, like a key turning in a lock that had been assumed rusted through. He said nothing further. He did not speak of the fire, or the scar, or the morning she had seen his arm. He said, "That will be all, Miss Marsh. Thank you." She stood. She was at the door when he spoke again, with the studied casualness of a man who has rehearsed the sentence and is releasing it all at once. "The letter you sometimes carry in your apron pocket, the folded one with the singed corner." She turned. He had not looked up from the desk. "Your father wrote well," he said. "Whatever it says." She did not ask how he knew it existed. She went out into the corridor and stood with her back against the wall and her eyes fixed on the ceiling, and her father's letter in her pocket and the lamp from the study throwing a bar of amber light under the door, and she thought about 7 years of carrying something and about how he had named the singed corner without being told. He sat at his desk for a quarter of an hour after she left, and did not write a word. He thought about a night, 7 years ago in November, a road he had taken because it was shorter, a column of smoke visible from the hill before he crested it, a cottage already fully alight, with the heat of it visible from 30 yards, a figure in a downstairs window that disappeared, and then appeared in the kitchen doorway and then fell in the lane. He thought about the cold ground and the weight of a girl who was not conscious enough to help him, and the way the fire had followed him out of the kitchen doorway and taken a length of his forearm before he was clear. He thought about the scar on his left arm that had not properly hurt since the first month of healing, but ached in cold weather, reliably, every year. He thought about the magistrate's letter he had written 3 times over the course of the following 2 years, adding each time what small new information he had managed to gather from the village, the county records, the solicitor's notes on debts that had come to his attention. The 3rd letter had finally produced a name, a man who had owed Edmund Marsh £40 for a year, and who had reason to believe that the physician's records would eventually surface the debt at a moment the man could not absorb. The magistrate's officer had pursued the name. The man had fled to Ireland before an arrest could be made. Incomplete. Radford had written one final letter the following year, received a final note in return, and had lived with the knowledge that incomplete was the most he was going to get. He thought about Edmund Marsh, who had treated 3 of Thornvale's tenants in the years before the fire, and been paid in kind because they had nothing else to offer, and who had kept a written record of every debt owed him and forgiven each one formally, in writing, at the new year. Radford had learned this from his own steward 2 years after Eleanor began her service, when the steward had mentioned the physician while reviewing the household's charitable accounts, and Radford had sat for a long moment with the knowledge that the girl he had pulled from the burning house was somewhere in his household, and he had not known it, had not recognized her, could not have recognized her because he had never seen her face clearly, only the shape of her in the smoke and the weight of her in the lane. He pressed the flat of his hand against the desk and allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had not yet said and had not yet found the right moment to say, and was increasingly uncertain he would manage to say before circumstances outran him. The dismissal came on a Thursday. Dressed as courtesy, the dowager had said nothing to Eleanor about the meeting in the study. She knew nothing about the scar. What she knew was what Grantham had made clear over the course of the week, that the Viscount's particular attention to a member of the household staff was a matter of social liability. That Miss Helena Brant remained an excellent and appropriate match for a man in the Viscount's position, and that the simplest resolution to an embarrassing domestic ambiguity was the domestic's timely and quiet removal. Lady Agatha Cahill was not a cruel woman by instinct. She was a woman who had governed a great household for 40 years, and who had in that time developed a habit of resolving inconvenient situations before they could become scenes. Eleanor was summoned to the dowager's sitting room on Thursday morning. The room was very still. The fire was precisely managed. Lady Agatha sat very straight in her chair, as she always did, in grey, and she was the kind of woman who wore grey in combinations that somehow never resolved into softness. "I will come to the point, Miss Marsh," she said. "You have served in this household for 3 years, and your work has been satisfactory throughout. You will receive an excellent reference, which I will write myself. I have arranged a position for you at Halverstock House, where Mrs. Mal. Pemberton requires a chambermaid of your experience. You will depart on Saturday." Eleanor sat very still. "I trust," Lady Agatha continued, with the careful precision of a woman who has calibrated every word, "that you understand the importance of knowing one's station. This household maintains certain standards, and a servant who has, perhaps inadvertently, one assumes, attracted a quality of notice to herself, would do well to begin again somewhere that the misapprehension has not yet taken hold. My son's cousin has only my nephew's best interests at heart, as I do. You are, I am certain, aware that you are, at the end of things, just a chambermaid, and that whatever attention you may have supposed yourself to have received is not attention of the kind that carries the meaning you might have wished it to carry." It was said perfectly, polished, precise, and technically, in every measurable sense, polite. Eleanor said, "I have not supposed anything, Lady Ashbourne. I have done my work." "Good," the dowager said. "Saturday, then. Mrs. Dunmore will settle your wages." Eleanor stood. She went to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, and she thought about 7 years of smooth expressions, and about her father's letter in her pocket, and about the fact that she was 24 years old, and she was very tired of being told that the truth would go unspoken if she did not say it. "My lord has never been anything but proper in every exchange we have had," she said, to the door rather than the room. "I would not wish you to believe otherwise on my account. Whatever the household imagines, it imagines without my assistance or encouragement." She left without waiting to hear the dowager's response. Mrs. Dunmore found her in the linen cupboard 20 minutes later. Eleanor said, "I am to go on Saturday." Mrs. Dunmore said nothing at first. She put her arms around Eleanor, who stood inside the embrace the way one stands inside a doorway during a cold rain, grateful and aware that it is not the same as shelter. "Nout." Then Mrs. Dunmore stepped back and said, with the particular quietness of a woman who has spent 30 years watching things unfold at Thornvale that the world at large would not have anticipated, "He does not know," Eleanor said. "He does not need to." Then, more quietly, "It is not his difficulty to solve." but the words cost something. And Mrs. Dunmore heard the cost in them, and neither of them said anything more. She packed on Friday evening. Pa! She folded her 3 plain dresses, with the care of someone who folds things well, because they have learned that doing things well is the only form of dignity available to them at certain moments. She placed her father's letter in the interior pocket of her traveling case, beside the small wooden box containing 2 buttons from her mother's winter coat, which she had saved because they were the kind of thing one saves when everything else has been lost. She allowed herself one long look from the window at the grounds of Thornvale Park. The gray stone walls, the bare October trees beyond the garden wall, the path to the west gate she had walked every morning for 3 years, in the specific early light of a household beginning its day. She did not cry. She had not cried about anything. In a very long time she was 24 years old. She had been invisible for 7 years. She was determined not to let anyone know how tired of it she was, which had come to feel like a form of survival in itself. The dinner the following evening was a county gathering, 24 people, the Cahill dining room at its full extension, candelabras lit along the length of the table and the silver recently polished to the point where Eleanor could see her own reflection moving in the serving pieces. Grantham had organized it, ostensibly, in honor of the Viscount's return from a week's business in London, during which the estate had felt the particular suspended quality of a household holding its breath. Miss Brant was seated at the table's second most significant position, the candlelight, very kind to her, as candlelight tends to be to those it has been arranged to flatter. The dowager sat opposite her son's chair, which remained empty. Eleanor served the remove. She was still a member of the household, until Saturday. She did her work. Tiverton arrived, 20 minutes after the soup course, apologizing for the state of the road and the lateness of his carriage, and was settled near the foot of the table. He had come, as Eleanor understood from the conversation around the table's edges, in connection with some estate matter that had been pending since the summer and that required the Viscount's signature. Grantham stood when the 3rd course had been cleared. He raised his glass with the confidence of a man who has rehearsed his own magnanimity. He said, "I wish to take this occasion to share what I believe will be welcome news to everyone assembled, that my cousin in his wisdom has recently indicated to Miss Brant's father his intention to formalize their acquaintance in the coming weeks, and that we may anticipate, before the new year, an engagement that will secure the succession of this household and see Thornvale Park enter a new era." Under the door, at the far end of the dining room, opened. Lord Ashbourne entered. He had ridden from London faster than expected. The roads had been better than the weather suggested, and he was still in his traveling coat, the cuffs slightly marked with road dust, his jaw set in the particular way it set when he had come directly from one thing to another without the interval he might have preferred. He took in the room in the way he always took in rooms, with the complete and unhurried comprehension of a man who does not waste the first moment of looking. His eyes moved across the table. They found Grantham standing with his glass raised. They moved across the gathered guests, their faces turned toward him. They found Eleanor at the sideboard, with a serving cloth in her hand, quite still. He crossed the room. Not to the table, not to his chair at the head of it. Across the full length of the Cahill dining room, which was not a short room, to the sideboard to Eleanor, with the particular steady, unhurried deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and intends no part of it to appear uncertain. The room did not make a sound. 23 people watched him cover 20 feet of dining room floor, and the only noise was the candles and the fire and the specific quality of hell breath that fills a room when something is happening, that everyone present understands the significance of. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a moment, and then he turned and looked at Grantham, who had sat down and was holding his glass, and was doing something with his face that had not yet resolved into an expression. "Miss Marsh is under my protection," Lord Ashbourne said. "She is to be my wife." 12 words, level, certain. Not loud. The dining room absorbed them with the stillness of a room that will be telling itself this story for years. Grantham said, "Radford, you have spoken on behalf of this household in my absence," the Viscount said, and his voice remained level. The measured instrument it always was, the kind of voice that does not need to rise to carry weight in every corner. "You have done so without my knowledge and without my permission, and you have represented an arrangement that does not exist. Miss Brand has my sincere respect and my apology for the position in which this evening's presumption has placed her. She is not to be held responsible for it in any degree." He looked at Miss Brand, who was sitting with her spine perfectly upright and her hands quite still in her lap, and her eyes very wide. "Miss Brand, my lord," she said quietly. She had the composure of a young woman who had been well trained for precisely the sort of room she now found herself in. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "to her alone." Then he looked back at Eleanor. The dowager had not spoken. She sat at the opposite end of the table with her fan in her hands and closed, and some calculation was moving behind her expression that Eleanor, even from across the room, could see arriving at its conclusion. Lady Agatha was not a woman who was wrong often. She was a woman who, when she was wrong, had the intelligence to recognize the exact moment at which the wrongness became undeniable and to face it with something approaching composure, because composure was the only currency she had ever fully trusted. She inclined her head. Once, slightly. In Eleanor's direction. It was not an apology. It was the closest she was going to come to one tonight, and both women understood this. And Eleanor accepted it for what it was. Tiverton cleared his throat from the foot of the table. "If I may," he said in the dry and perfectly calibrated voice of a man who has witnessed a considerable number of things in his professional life and has learned to express only the facts that are needed. "As the estate's solicitor of long standing, I can confirm that the Viscount of Ashbourne is, of course, entirely at liberty to make whatever match he considers appropriate, and that any matter pertaining to the succession or the future of this estate is his sole determination. The paperwork, in that event, can be completed at his earliest convenience." He said it without drama, the way one states a fact that has never been otherwise. Grantham set down his glass. He said nothing more. He looked at the table. The room, in ones and twos, found its breath again. Voices restarted, tentative at first and then, with more confidence, the way water finds its level after a disruption. The dinner continued. It continued differently from how it had begun, and everyone at the table was aware of this, and most of them seemed, cautiously, carefully, not entirely displeased. Eleanor stood at the sideboard and did not trust herself to move for a moment. She could feel her heart at the base of her throat and the prickle at her eyes that she had no intention of permitting to become anything further, because she had not cried in front of anyone since her father's funeral. And she did not intend to begin now, not in the Cahill dining room, not with 23 witnesses. Not after having maintained herself for 7 years. She pressed her fingernails lightly into her palm and breathed slowly the way her father had taught her when she was young and overwhelmed, one breath, then another, until you can think again. Lord Ashbourne, standing beside her, said in a voice pitched for her alone, "Come into the hall a moment." She went. In the hall, with the dining room door closed behind them, and the draught from the west corridor making the candlelight move, he looked at her with the quality of attention she had spent 3 years refusing to name. "You were going to leave without telling me," he said. "I did not believe it was my place to tell you," she said. "Your mother is my mother," he said. "Not the architect of my choices." A pause. She looked at him. She said, "You knew." "In the study you knew who I was." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise. He had been waiting for this. He had been carrying it alongside his own knowledge, and she saw now that the weight of it had been considerable. "I suspected." He said the name. "The county. Your father's name. I wrote to the village solicitor last month to confirm what I could, and he confirmed enough." He paused. "I was not certain how to say what needed to be said. And then your mother, my mother, moved before I had found the right moment. You should have said something sooner." "Yes," he said simply without defense. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 7 years and incomplete justice, and a man who had written 3 letters to a magistrate on behalf of a girl he did not know, and had carried the unsatisfying result of those letters for all the time between. She put her hand into her apron pocket and drew out the folded letter, singed at one corner, the wax seal long since broken and resealed with plain wax that did not match the original, and held it. He looked at it. He looked at her. "My father left it for me," she said. "The morning of the fire. I have never read it to anyone. You do not have to read it to me," he said. "No," she said. "I know." She put it back in her pocket. He held out his left hand, palm up, the scarred forearm turned where the light could find it, and she put her hand in his. They stood like that for a long moment, in the draught of the Thornvale Hall, the dining room murmuring behind the closed door, the fire lit in the grate at the corridor's end. Outside the windows, the first cold rain of November had begun against the glass. The dinner resolved. Resolved. The guests departed, carriage by carriage, into the wet November evening, their voices carrying briefly through the open front door, and then extinguished by the weather. Miss Brant departed without drama, and with her composure intact, which Eleanor thought spoke well of her. Grantham departed without speaking to either his cousin or Eleanor, which spoke, perhaps, to something else. The dowager stopped beside Eleanor in the drawing-room, as the last guests were assembling to leave. She said, "You have surprised me, Miss Marsh." She said it without warmth and without cruelty, which was, from her, a kind of honesty. "I do not often allow for surprises," Eleanor said. "I did not intend to surprise you, Lady Ashbourne. I only intended to do my work as well as I could manage." The dowager looked at her for a long moment, and then she inclined her head once more and moved to say her farewells. Eleanor watched her go and thought, "That is as much as it will be, and it is enough. Mr. Ranger." Tiverton, on his way to the door with his hat in his hand, stopped beside Eleanor and said, with the brief, dry satisfaction of a man who has spent 40 years in the law and considers certain facts worth naming, "Your father's reputation, Miss Marsh, was never in question among the people in this county who knew their business. I am glad that his daughter is known to be." His daughter, he bowed slightly and went out into the rain. She stood in the empty drawing-room for a moment, after he had gone, and let herself feel the weight of that sentence, which was a different weight from any she had been carrying. By the time the last carriage had rounded the gate, Thornvale Park was quiet again in the particular way it went quiet after a great noise, not silent, but settled, breathing differently, the rooms resuming their ordinary dimensions after an evening in which they had felt larger than usual. Mrs. Dunmore had seen to the fires. The study was still lit. Eleanor and Lord Ashbourne sat in the study with the November rain pressing at the windows and the candles burning lower, and she took her father's letter from her pocket and held it for a moment, and then unfolded it, and she read it aloud. She read all of it. It was not a long letter. Her father had written it in the morning before his calls, and he had not had more than 20 minutes for it, and it showed in the way that letters written in 20 minutes often show the truest things, because there is no time to arrange them. He had written about the light that particular morning, which had been the kind of clear, sharp light that only comes in November, the kind that makes everything look exactly as it is. He had written about her, about what he knew of her character, about the things he had watched her do, without credit, and the ones he believed she would do when he was not there to watch. He had written about courage, which he said was not the absence of fear but the decision to act from one's values before the fear could change the decision. He had written at the end that, whatever came next, he had faith she would carry herself with the dignity he had tried to show her, and the courage he had always suspected she possessed, even before she had suspected it herself. She read it in a voice that held steady, nearly, until the last line. And then did not. Radford did not say anything. He put his arm around her, the scarred one, and she let it settle across her shoulders. And she pressed her face briefly against his coat and stayed there while the rain continued at the windows. And it was very quiet, and the fire was very steady. After a while she sat back and folded the letter and placed it in her pocket, and he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and drew out a folded paper, different from hers, unsinged, the paper slightly yellowed with age, and placed it on the desk between them. She looked at him. He said, "I made a copy of the last letter I sent to the magistrate. I kept it so that I would not forget that I had tried." He paused. "In case you ever wanted to know what trying looked like when it was incomplete." She looked at the paper on the desk. She reached out and touched it, the edge of it, with 2 fingers. She did not unfold it. "He would have written you a very good letter," she said, "about what you did." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "He already did." He touched his left forearm, through the sleeve, where the scar lay beneath the wool. "Not in words." She looked at his arm. She looked at his face. She said for the first time what she had known since the morning of the first week of October. "It was you." "Yes," he said. She let out a breath that had, she realized, been held for 7 years, or some part of it. And he took her hand again, the one that had been steady for so long, and held it in both of his, and the fire burned and the rain continued, and outside the study windows the grounds of Thornvale Park were dark and wet and familiar. And the lane beyond the gate was the same lane it had always been. The candle nearest the window had burned to its last quarter-inch. It guttered once in the draught from the door when Mrs. Breck Dunmore passed in the corridor, and caught again and held. If Eleanor's story has stayed with you, leave a word about it below. It is always good to know when someone has been listening. And wherever you find yourself tonight, thank you for staying until the end.